Good evening, Council. I'm Kathleen Mallory, Planning and Sustainability Manager with the City of Oxnard, and today I'll be presenting an ordinance to regulate expanded polystyrene. Polystyrene plastic includes expanded polystyrene, and it's known by the trademark name Styrofoam, and it's a rigid polystyrene type of plastic. EPS is most commonly used for food and packaging products, materials, and it's not processable at our local waste collection facilities. Most hard plastics are recyclable by the city, with the exception of EPS products. EPS is slow to degrade, leaches chemicals into the environment, and production and degradation contribute to the litter and pollution problem associated with EPS. In July of this year, City Council approved an ordinance restricting the distribution of single-use foodware accessories and standard condiment materials, but that action did not restrict or prohibit EPS within the city. In November of this year, the Community Services, Public Safety, Housing, and Development Committee reviewed the ordinance before you today and recommended approval of this ordinance. The EPS regulatory approach that we're recommending is consistent with the approach being used in a number of Ventura County cities. The first is step one, to regulate EPS and non-encased EPS through our ordinance. The second step would happen later down the road, and it would include the regulation of rigid plastics and other single-use plastic materials when Ventura County processing facilities become operational and compostable recycling markets become available in Ventura County to handle the processing of rigid plastic. We're understanding that a local processing facility should be available in the near future. Within our ordinance, what is proposed to be regulated? First would be two types of products: single-use disposable products. Those are the types that you see, the styrofoam plates or bowls or trays, wrappers, the clamshells or condiment containers, as well as cups and drinkware. Those are standard types that you would think of in terms of what would be regulated by the EPS ordinance. Also proposed to be regulated is something called non-encapsulated EPS products. That means products that don't have a plastic on the outside to contain the flimsy styrofoam that breaks down into a million different little pieces. In addition to that, the regulation that we're proposing within this ordinance would include prohibiting EPS products for packaging cushions, like packing peanuts or noodles, or packaging material associated with shipping and manufacturing that is made out of non-compostable materials. So the types of businesses that would be subject to this ordinance would be what you would expect: typical grocery and food providers. That would include mobile food truck vendors, sidewalk vendors, outdoor food sale establishments, restaurants, cafes. We also, as I mentioned in that prior slide, the packaging material would be prohibited. Non-EPS packaging material would be prohibited in the city, and that would impact potentially warehouse and manufacturing businesses that use EPS in their packaging, distribution, and shipping process. There are a number of compostable options to EPS that warehousing and manufacturing businesses could use. In our research in putting together this ordinance, it's our estimate that about 1,300 food providers, businesses or persons, or warehousing and manufacturing businesses would be subject to this ordinance. The EPS ordinance before you does have some carve-outs and some exemptions to the EPS ordinance. The first would be a business that would be shipping in prepared foods, provided, so for example, if they're on an EPS-based food tray, then that food item is not subsequently unwrapped and repackaged. So if it's a food packaging that is happening out a food item that is placed on an EPS-based tray, and they ship it into the city, and the business doesn't unwrap it or repackage it, then that food item and the tray upon which it's on actually would be exempt from the ordinance. There are also some situations where there's types of medicines or biotech materials or food that has to comply with Food and Drug Administration in terms of packaging. And so that would also be exempt from the regulations. And examples of that include EPS containers for or trays for raw butchered meats or fish, provided that the poultry is not manufactured or altered within the city. So if you're like a fish processor where there's no other alternative to that EPS tray in order to comply with the Food and Drug Administration packaging requirements, that fish business would be exempt from this ordinance. Additionally, a few other exemptions include, in the theme of what I just mentioned regarding the fish or meat packaging facility, EPS materials used to ship goods and products when within the city when there's no other viable alternative, materials secured in response to an emergency due to public health or safety requirements, that would be an exemption in the ordinance. And then EPS products, packaging products which have been received from a source outside of the city may be reused in order to keep them out of the waste stream. That's also a carve out within the ordinance. When this item went to committee, there was a question regarding the cost differential to procure compliant materials. In our research, we found that it would be roughly 2 cents more per unit for disposable foodware to procure EPS compliant packaging materials. Another question came up at the committee meeting as well as with the community, which I'll cover in a few minutes. There were questions regarding supply chain issues and concerns that the production of EPS compliant materials was not robust and that we didn't have local sources available. We actually found that supply chains are robust and there are a number of local options to procure compliant materials. We also heard some questions regarding engagement efforts to help local vendors procure non-EPS options. And so that was another issue that was raised by the committee as well as the community when we met with them. Some concerns regarding helping businesses identify local vendors who could sell compliant materials. The ordinance that we're proposing has a kind of a 6-month window. It's written to take effect 6 months after adoption and implementation to allow time for the ordinance to be reviewed by impacted businesses and organizations, meaning during the first 6 months of the effectiveness of the ordinance will become the education period. This period where we will educate the businesses about the EPS ordinance. This also, the 6-month time frame, will allow businesses and organizations to use up previously purchased non-compliant products. And again, as I mentioned, for those businesses to receive information about where to procure compliant products. We're calling this a phased operative approach. And again, that phased approach that we've identified on the slide is consistent with many other, with the implementation schedule proposed within many other jurisdictions. It's recommended that there will be a phase-in period of 6 months after adoption of the ordinance, and then that would happen up to 1 year after the ordinance is adopted. So education would happen for the first 6 months, and the 6 months after that, up to 1 year, would be the time where we would begin the enforcement period. Violators cited within that period of time may submit proof of purchase of any non-EPS containing foodware products in an amount totaling or exceeding the amount of the fine in order to comply with the ordinance. And that would be in lieu of the payment of the fine. The ordinance would be fully enforced 12 months after adoption, and there would be no payment in lieu of payment procurement of compliant materials. On November and February of this year, the committee received an update on staff's efforts to prepare the EPS ordinance. Staff's extensive engagement is summarized in the staff report, attachment 1. As a result of the various outreach efforts, a carve-out for fish and meat processing facilities was added due to the lack of non-EPS compliant packaging, distribution, and shipping alternatives. A survey that was developed showed general support for the EPS ordinance before you this evening and the proposed 6-month phase-in period. Community concern was expressed regarding the costs associated with securing compliant products and what would be covered by the EPS ordinance. Staff's research indicated that supply chain issues are not an issue. Product production is robust and the sources are readily available. Community concern was also expressed for the development of a compliant material replacement program, a request for bilingual materials for businesses, the identification of a dedicated non-compliant drop-off location, and the date by when unused non-compliant materials should no longer be used. There was also general support for the English and Spanish survey engagement materials that we provided. The Community Services, Public Safety, Housing, and Development Committee recommended approval of the ordinance before you this evening. Staff's recommendation is that the City Council introduce the first reading by title only and waive further reading of an ordinance adding the EPS ordinance to Chapter 7 of the Oxnard City Code, prohibiting the use, manufacturing, distribution, and sale of designated polystyrene products, and find that the ordinance is not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to Section 15061 B3 of the CEQA guidelines. This concludes staff's presentation.